Are you actually being a good steward of your money? Or does it just feel like you are? Because what if I told you that every financial decision that you make is costing you something, even when you think you're doing the right thing? Most people have never been taught to think this way, and it might explain why, even when you're doing everything right, you're still not getting ahead. Welcome to the Bankless by Design podcast, where we rethink money, ditch the system, and rediscover what it means to truly thrive well. I'm Tricia Miller, mom of 7, financial coach, and founder of ThriveWell. Around here, we believe wealth is more than numbers. It's about freedom, stewardship, and building a legacy that lasts. If you're ready to challenge the norm and take back control of your financial life, you're in the right place. Hello, and welcome to the Bankless by Design podcast. My name is Tricia Miller, and I'm your host. And today we're continuing through our Becoming Your Own Banker series. And before we even get into the chapter, I want to start with a statement that Nelson makes that I believe is foundational to everything that we're going to talk about. He says this: the very first principle that must be understood is that you finance everything you buy. You either pay interest to someone else or you give up interest that you could have earned otherwise. Now, I really want you to think about that for a second, because if it's true, then maybe we need to rethink what good stewardship actually looks like. And that's exactly where this next verse comes in. So for those of you who are following along in the book, today we're going to be looking at the chapter titled Creating Your Own Banking System Through Dividend Paying Whole Life Insurance. That's on page 21 in the 5th edition. And at the very top of this chapter, Nelson puts Matthew 25:27. And it says, "You should have put my money on deposit with the bankers so that when I returned, I would have received it back with interest." Now, that's an interesting verse to lead a chapter on creating your own banking system. So the question is, why that one? Why did Nelson choose that verse to set the stage for everything that's going to follow? And you know he's inviting us to check it out. So let's go take a look at where this comes from. This verse comes from the parable of the talents. And just to briefly give some context, Jesus is speaking to his disciples about the time in between when he will be leaving them and when he returns. So to summarize the parable, a master is going on a journey and he entrusts his property to his servants. To one he gives 5 talents, and to another 2, and to another 1 talent, each one according to their ability. And then he leaves. The first servant goes and puts the money to work, and he doubles it. The second servant does the same. But the third servant does something very different. He takes the money, he digs a hole in the ground, and he hides it. And when the master returns, he speaks to both the first and the second servant, and to each of them he says, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master." And then the third servant comes forward and says, "Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid. So I hid your money. Here, take what is yours." And the master responds, "You wicked and slothful servant, you should have put my money on deposit with the bankers, and at my return I would have received it back with interest." Now that's the very verse that Nelson chose to put at the top of this section. Now let's think about what's really happening here. A talent was not a small amount of money. This was a significant sum. It is the highest monetary unit available at the time, and it was actually worth something like 15 to 20 years worth of the average person's wage. So this is a lot. And the master is entrusting this to his servants. The first 2 servants, they go to work and they're productive and they multiply what they've been given. But the third servant, he does nothing of the sort. At first glance, It might look like just laziness, and he is condemned for laziness. But if you listen closely what he says, there's actually more than that. He says he was afraid. So what does he do? He protects himself. He saves his own skin. He buries the money in a way that ensures that he cannot be held responsible for any loss. In other words, he's not just being passive, he's actually avoiding responsibility. And this is consistent with what we know from rabbinical law at the time, because according to Jewish teaching, if someone entrusted you with money and you immediately buried it in the ground, you were considered not liable for any loss. So this servant wasn't just being lazy. He was actually doing what the culture would have considered prudent. He was protecting himself, and yet the master still calls him wicked. And this is where everything shifts. The master doesn't say, well, at least you didn't lose it. He doesn't commend him for preserving the capital. In fact, he rebukes him. Why? Well, because apparently breaking even and just returning what was already rightfully his was considered a loss. Now let that sink in for a minute. Breaking even was actually a loss because the money had the capacity to grow. Time had passed, and it says the master went on a long journey. So this is a good amount of time that has passed. And the growth that could have happened during that time never happened. That time is lost forever, and so is the opportunity, which tells us something really important. This passage is not neutral when it comes to money. What we see here is not that it is immoral to profit from what has been entrusted to you. In fact, the expectation is that you should. The alternative to profit then is not just preservation, it's actually loss. The loss of wealth, especially when it comes from inaction. And this is not presented as virtue. It's presented as unfaithfulness. And this is exactly what Nelson is getting at when he says, you finance everything you buy. Because what the third servant did was give up the interest that money could have earned. He ignored the opportunity cost. And according to the master, that was not faithful stewardship. Opportunity cost is something that we hear about on occasion, but let's be honest, most people don't actually do anything with it. We don't live like it's true. Nelson goes on to say here, people give lip service to this fact, but they don't put it into practice in their own financial dealings. It is the equivalent of thinking that the law of gravity applies to everyone else but them. And yet the reality is every single dollar that you have that comes into your life has an alternate use. It could be doing something. It could be growing. And when it isn't, something is being lost. So sure, you invest your 5 or your 10% and you look for growth on that money. But what about the other 90%? I don't think your financial advisor is advising you of what to do with the other 90%. Now let's take this one step deeper, because this parable isn't just about money. The master actually owns everything. This is an important truth. Not just the talents, but actually the servants too. And as a believer, we need to reconcile that. We are not our own. We have been bought with a price. We belong to Christ. And everything we have, our time, our talents, our money, our energy, all of our resources, it all belongs to God. It has been entrusted to us. So the question is not, what do I want to do with my money? The question is, am I being faithful with everything that has been entrusted to me? Am I using my mind? Am I thinking creatively? Am I learning? We were created to take what we've been given and to do something with it, to be productive, to be creative. And notice in the parable, it wasn't about who had more. The one with 2 talents received the exact same praise as the one with 5. Why? Because both were faithful. It wasn't about how much you have. It's about what you do with what you have. that's really important because there's a tendency, especially in religious circles, to view profit with suspicion, as if earning more, producing more, multiplying what you have been given is somehow less spiritual. But that's not what we see here. The servants who produced were commended. And yet in our culture today, there's often a push toward equality of outcome. The idea that differences in wealth or ability are somehow inherently just, and we all deserve to have the same exact thing. But that's not the picture we see here in Scripture. The master gives to each of these servants according to their ability. It's okay for us to have differences. One receives 5, one receives 2, and another receives 1. And the one who receives less is not excused for having less. He's still expected to be faithful with what he has. The third servant says the master is a hard man. His perspective has a lot to do with everything. What if he had gone to the one with 5 talents and said, teach me? What if he actually did his very best and still lost some money? I wonder if he would have been commended then for at least trying. But he was so sure the master was a hard man. So clearly he didn't have the same relationship with the master that the others did, which may be part of the point here as well. Now, I often like to look at how other believers throughout history might have handled a particular issue. And I discovered a simple statement from the Puritans that captures an idea about money beautifully. And I want to share that with you. And the statement is that money exists for the glory of God and the good of others. That is powerful. I want to put that up on my wall because I believe that that will keep us out of both ditches. It's not about hoarding wealth. It's not about greed and going after money for selfish gain, but it's not about rejecting it either. Because how can we share with others? How can we help others? How can we do the good of others if we don't multiply what we've been given, if we don't steward it well? So when you combine that with what we see in this parable, productivity becomes a means of service. Money is a tool. It's a means of caring for those we love and for others. So now let's bring this into today, because this is where it gets really practical. We've been taught a certain way to handle money. We all have our own ideas and beliefs about money, but there's an idea that has been foisted upon the church that I have been concerned about as I have learned more about the infinite banking concept. And that is this idea that whole life insurance is a scam. So buy term insurance and invest the difference. That's the mantra. And you should also pay cash for everything. Now, I want to ask the question, is that actually good stewardship? Let's talk about it. So term insurance, it's temporary. Most of the time, it never pays out. It is the biggest moneymaker for an insurance company because they receive all the premiums, but they never have to pay the death claims because 99% of the time, people pass away long after the term insurance has expired. So every dollar that goes into it is essentially gone. And it's not thinking generationally. It stops before you do. Then we're told to invest the difference because, we bought cheap term, so we're investing the difference. And I would ask the question, are you actually doing that? Are you actually taking the difference between the cost of term and whole life insurance and actually investing it? And then where do we invest it? In the market, of course, in a 401k, in an index fund. So we take on risk, speculative risk. It's not the calculated and educated risk of an entrepreneur or a business owner. We pay the fees on 100% of that investment. And then the IRS gains 30% of the take on the harvest rather than the seed. And they charge you a penalty if you have need of it early. So my question to you is that good stewardship? I'm going to let you answer that one for yourself. But I do find it very curious that when it comes to the church itself, as an organization, most churches would never invest the money that they receive in tithes and offerings in the market. Why not? They will say, we can't do that. That's God's money. It's not good stewardship. So why, if it's not good stewardship for the church, is it okay for you or for your family? Isn't that God's money too? How do we reconcile that clear disconnect? It's contradictory. I'll leave you with that to consider. And then there's paying cash. We're told that that's the responsible thing to do. It's less expensive than taking on third-party debt. And to the degree that we can't control our spending, there's probably some truth in that. But what does Nelson say? He says you finance everything you buy. This is an economic principle that businesses understand, but the vast majority of people do not consider. So when you pay cash, you're actually giving up the interest that money could have earned forever, just like the third servant. If it's true that you finance everything that you buy, and if it's true that every dollar has the potential to grow, not just our 10% investment, but 100% of the dollars flowing through our personal economies, then the question becomes, are we actually being faithful stewards of what we've been given? Or are we unknowingly doing exactly what the third servant did? Because it's very easy to give lip service to stewardship and never really examine how our money is actually functioning. So maybe a better question isn't just, how am I spending my money? But what is my money actually doing when I'm not paying attention to it? These are questions worth asking. And you may be saying, but Tricia, how do we avoid that opportunity cost? We have to live. We have to spend some of our money. I mean, for goodness sakes, we have to buy groceries. We have to pay for the mortgage. We can't invest 100% of our income. And I would say you're right. That's true. And this is the genius of the infinite banking concept. It has the solution for recapturing the opportunity cost, the growth on the other 90% that is leaving your economy every week, every month, and every year of your life. It doesn't happen overnight, but stick with me and we're going to see how this works. Meanwhile, I ask you to consider, what are some ways that we as individuals, or even as a church, may not be stewarding all that we've been given? I'd love to get your feedback in the comments. And more than anything, I want to encourage you, go back and read the parable for yourself. Sit with it. Ask questions, because there's so much in there. And I have certainly not covered it all. In our next episode, we're going to continue with this chapter and go deeper into Nelson's process. But until then, if this episode was helpful or insightful, I would sincerely love it if you would like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might benefit from this conversation. And as always, thank you so much for listening and have a great week. Thanks for tuning in to the Bankless by Design podcast, where we're done with the system and we're doing money differently. Be sure to subscribe, share this episode with someone who needs it, and visit us at banklessbydesign.com to learn how you can start living Bankless by Design.